founders of this country, the United States, back in 1800, late 1700s, when we became a country, we had very low standing in economic development in the world. When we think of the United States in right, the year 2011 is, well, we're struggling a little bit, but still a superpower. You have to think back 1700s when we were founded as a nation. 1800s, we were on bottom. And so the theory that the founders had was that if we give a lot of freedom in a constitution and allow a lot of individual freedom, limited government, Article 1, Section 8, explicitly limiting the powers of Congress. We limited the powers of the president. You limit government, give maximum freedom. You know, there's no provision for an income tax in the Constitution. The idea is that we'll get money by having, say, a cigarette tax, which we call excise taxes, or maybe a tariff on imports, a tax on imported goods. That's it. That's it. We're going to have small government, lots of freedom. Entrepreneurs will emerge. The United States will rise. That's the idea. How many are history majors here, by the way? Okay. Hey, quite a few. Good, good. Now, how many are econ majors? Quite a few econ. See, this is the juxtaposition of history and economics, which is really fun. Right? Because we're looking back. How did you have economic ideas, but how did this work in history? The idea that we can turn a lot of economic growth over to the entrepreneurs, then we will have development from that. Well, the United States is going strong. I want to say that. And we're still way behind. The United States lagging behind, and it would look, an economic development curve looks a little bit like this because England and Europe is growing seemingly at a more rapid rate than we are in the United States. We're moving upward a little bit, but see, England is going through an industrial revolution in the early 1800s. Mass production factories. Clothing is the first product to be mass-produced, so you get mass-produced clothing. So United States ends up having to import British clothes if we want mass-produced clothes. Then we finally catch on a little bit, and then they move into mass production of iron and steel, so they're doing railroads. Now, can you see what's happening here? The United States, trusting entrepreneurs, is moving along here a little bit upward. England, going through an industrial revolution, is ahead of us. Now, can you see the arguments? We're going to have two arguments that are going to come forward, and I want to go through both of those. The first argument simply is, if you'll trust in the freedom and the entrepreneurs, that eventually is going to push the United States upward. But the counter argument, which is coming into play in the 1800s, is this. If England is going through industrial revolution and they've got mass production of clothing and they're beating us in railroads, and we're down here, our people are so far behind that, I mean, freedom is good and all that, but we need government to come in and help. We've got to jumpstart our industries. See? Oh, sure, entrepreneurs are good, except they're way ahead of us already. What we need to do, see, the idea is concentrate some government funds behind some entrepreneurs to allow them to get some advantage that England has. Then when we catch up, let's talk about freedom. But otherwise, they're going to keep beating us. We're going to be way behind, and we'll be sitting there, free people, all on farms somewhere making $100 a year. They will have big cities, big industries, big factories, gigantic economic development, and that is the wave of the future. This debate was big in the United States in the early 1800s. You watch England win the battle in textiles. You watch them win the battle in railroads. You watch the United States in the 1830s when we're starting to try to build railroads. We're importing the track from the British. We're importing locomotives. We try to get people to migrate from England who know how to do this so they can show us how. Now, you can see the critics who want the government to jumpstart the economy are saying, yeah, really good entrepreneurs here. Very sarcastically, what we need is government to come in and help. Well, this came to a head in steamships. Steamships are developed that can do those trips across the Atlantic Ocean in record time. And the steamship development, which comes after really about the same time the railroads, is where a lot of people say, okay, look what's going on here. They're beating us in textiles, they're beating us in railroads. Now come steamships. And to put it another way, look over, do it this way. If you have the United States, and we're over here in this part of the world, the eastern part, there's our border, see, with Canada. I'm good on the border. And there is Florida, okay, and Texas and all that. There we are. Now over here is England. I would draw all of Europe except I have no place on the map, so you'll have to use your imagination. So there is England over there. Now, you have New York City over here, and there's England. So you have, say, Liverpool over there. Now, you have the steamship, which is going to shorten really the time that you can get back and forth, if you can see. And that's important for economic development. The steamship, in a way, it seems, well, that doesn't sound very dramatic. When I said steamships, I didn't just see a lot of, when I said railroads, I could see nodding. Steamships was kind of, But it's the internet of its day. It is, really, because it compresses the time of communication, which is just sort of what the internet does today. When Columbus came over to the New World, it took him almost 3 months. Now, he had several voyages, between 2 and 3 months, depending on wind currents, because you're dependent on wind currents. Now, think of it this way. If you're trying to have economic development between Europe and the United States, and it takes you 2 to 3 months to get over here, 2 to 3 months to get back, I mean, look at how prices look how the price of gases changes from month to month. You're sitting there and you've got products to sell. They could be dramatically shifting in prices. It could work to your advantage. It could work to your disadvantage. Then you've got to buy products. In other words, you take something from the United States, maybe wheat, food, we sold that. You bring it over here, hope the price of wheat hasn't been crushed. Then you buy English blankets, which are produced in their textile business. Or shirts. You bring those back and you hope that the price hasn't collapsed when you come back. Meanwhile, you've got to support 5 months of having a crew on the ocean, and you've got to feed them. You have insurance costs, because we even had pirates back then. And you have all sorts of issues that are going to bring the costs of going back. Now, when you get 2 to 3 months, and that was Columbus in 1492. That's what it was in 1820. 2 to 3 months, because you still had sailing power to get back and forth. Now, the steamship allows you, with steam power, to go against the current through the ocean at greater speeds. Instead of being 2 to 3 months, try 2 weeks or less to get across the ocean. Let me just think of it this way. It's June. It changed so dramatically the way people think and communicate from one hemisphere of the world to the other, is that if you were in New York City and you wanted to, by steamship, trade in England, you could bring a boatload of wheat on June 1st, come over to Liverpool, England, drop it off, buy blankets or English muskets or Springfield rifles, whatever. You buy products over here in England, bring them back to New York City, and you arrive back in New York City and it's still June. Look at the diminishment of costs on shipping costs for a crew. The diminishment of the time gap that causes such a fluctuation in price. You're compressing all that. Insurance, all of this. Because now you can sell it cheaper. Think of the difference it makes for immigration. If you're an immigrant, you don't have to have a huge... I mean, imagine this. If you want to migrate from Europe to the United States because you like the freedom, you have to either bring with you this is before the steamship, a 2 to 3 month food supply for your family. Can you imagine that? Just carrying we don't have refrigerators, of course. You're going to bring this huge, big bundle of food or buy it on board for months. Well, that really inhibits the cost of migration. Now you talk about 10 days to 12 days to 2 weeks at the most. Well, that makes it a lot easier to think about. A lot easier to think about. And that's why I say the steamship was a major invention in the early 1800s, almost as much maybe as the railroad in some ways. They both are improving transportation dramatically. And England, of course, developed the first steamship business going overseas. And that's when we said, okay, are we just going to sit here and fall behind? A man named Edward Collins testified before Congress because he ran steamships. He says, look, are we going to lag behind England and let them beat us there and then end up 20 years later, would you please sell us one of your steamships? We'd kind of like to buy one so that maybe we could catch up with you people. Are we going to sit there and be like that? Or are we going to use the power of government to bring revenue together to fund someone, to give them the capital to compete? This is a big debate. Are we going to rely on freedom and entrepreneurs, or are we going to jumpstart the economy and use government to tax people, bring the funds in, and contribute to economic development? The power of government's on the line here. The role of entrepreneurs is on the line. A lot of the future of the United States is going to be decided in these decisions. And Edward Collins said, I'm very happy to report that is exactly what's happening here. And he said, I'll tell you what, I will volunteer to receive a subsidy, to receive this money and lead the way for our country to surpass the British. I'll do it. Someone has to make the sacrifice. And when we said, well, I don't know, he said, I just happen to have plans here in my pocket, which he pulled out, which he said indicate that if you'll give me a subsidy of $385,000, and by the way, this is in an era when the national debt of the United States in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s never exceeded $50 million. Never. A tremendous belief on the part of the United States founders and the next generation that a sound currency and no debt is also, along with entrepreneurs, the way toward economic development and growth. So we had very low national debt. So he's saying, I know that the national debt is low. When he was asking this, it was about $10 million. He says, so when I asked for $385,000 a year, I mean, think about that. That's a 3% of the national debt. So he's saying, I would like a $385,000. Of course, this is pre-inflation. That could get you a lot, $385,000. And he said, these are startup costs that are going to help me compete against the British, who already have this head start. And a lot of people said, well, is it constitutional? Where in the Constitution does it say the federal government should fund steamships? And whoa, then it was quick. Excuse me a minute. He had to check, and he thought, this is interesting. I'm reading the Constitution. An interesting document. And he discovered that it said that the federal government in mail delivery, see, with post roads, they called them, had authority. He says, I'll deliver the mail. I'll even call it the Collins Mail Steamship Company. I'm this constitutional company out there. I'll deliver mail to London and back. And so here it is, it's $385,000. Now, I hope I won't need a subsidy after that. I don't know, but I hope I won't. These are startup costs, this $385,000. And Congress began to debate and said, well, $385,000, that's a lot. He said, well, I do have one other thing I have to tell you. I'll need another $3 million to build me the ships. So some are saying, so we have a national debt of $10 million, and you want $3 million to build ships and $385,000 for startup costs. Yeah, but it's worth it because at the end of the line, what we have is we catch up with England because of me. I show what can be done. It'll be an American thing. You give me the money, then I compete with the British and I beat them instead of just sitting back and letting the British dominate yet another industry. Congress listened to this pitch and they accepted it. It took a while. 1847, Congress accepts Edward Collins's offer. We become a nation that shifts gears to all of a sudden go into the subsidy business to help us catch up with England to deliver those goods back and forth from England to the United States. It's the first, I got so excited, I did research on this. It's the first chapter of my book, The Myth of the Robber Barons, is the Edward Collins story. And I looked in the congressional record, did research on this to look at the votes, the debates. Collins said this is a major turning point in American history and it's going to mean the triumph of the United States. And he went out and he built those ships. The United States is in business. He builds 4 ships for the $3 million. He puts 2 of them in New York City, where he starts, 2 of them in Liverpool. And you can see the strategy here. He has ship number 1 goes from New York City to Liverpool, and this on Monday. You know, you get the idea of the set time, which we take for granted. Like a lot of you may have, how many came here to Atlanta through an airplane, by an airplane? Looks like most of you. And I'll bet it has a set time that you're going to be leaving, right? How many kind of even know what your time is that you're going to be leaving? Well, I mean, we take that for granted, but in the 1800s, it used to be when the plane, we didn't have airplanes, but so it'd be ships or it would be that. When the ship is full, then we leave. Yeah, can you imagine that now? Well, when you're going back, I noticed some of you are from Colorado, like Denver or something. Yeah, from Atlanta to Denver. When we get enough people in Atlanta that are on the Denver plane, we'll take off. We'll go back. Yeah. Well, Collins says improvements are coming because I have a subsidy. I'm going to have one of my ships, I'm going to go there, and then I go from New York City to Liverpool, and that very Monday, and we'll have it at 8 o'clock, this ship goes this way, see? Then the next Monday, ship number 2 goes here. Ship number 2 goes from Liverpool. And then, as you see, because it's less than 2 weeks, ship number 1 arrives, they refurbish it, and then it goes out the next Monday. So that you have constant Monday traffic back and forth. It's innovation time, Collins said. And now that I have the subsidy, we can see the wonderful things that can be accomplished if we'll only get government involved. And so Collins is on his way, and at the end of 1 year, we had the business. It was up and running. When he came in, because he was given a 1-year subsidy for the $385,000, and when he came back, congressmen were shaking his hands. You know, we see the ships that are out there. You're moving goods and traffic to and from England, and you're doing the mail and freight and all of this stuff. Passengers, he had a rate that would vary between $150 to $200 a passenger. All of this was taking place. And Collins said, I receive your gratitude. I'm glad that I could make this innovation and help my country. He said, now I do have to say something. I got off to a slow start with my ships, and so actually I'll need another subsidy for next year of $400,000. Because I got off to a slow start. People didn't know I was in business. It took me 6 months to get the ships built and everything. And then they didn't know, now I'm really going strong. But should we keep this enterprise going or not? My request is for $400,000. Congress gave Collins the $400,000. And the next year, Collins came before Congress and said, I'm glad to be here. Everything is going fine. I'm going to need $500,000 next year because I had caulking issues. One of my ships went out for a while. I had to recalk it. I couldn't get my Monday service going. I had to borrow a ship. All of these costs came in. I'll need $500,000 next year. The next year, Collins came before Congress and requested $600,000 to continue in his business and received it. There were some people who were beginning to look at this with a bit of a, what's going on here? Let me look at this carefully. One of these people who was skeptical was someone you may have heard of named Cornelius Vanderbilt. He had gotten into the steamship business, Vanderbilt had. He was nicknamed the Commodore. And Vanderbilt said, I think what we're witnessing here is absurd. He said, I'm going to go before Congress. He said, I don't know what Collins is going to ask for next year, but whatever he asked for, he came before Congress and said, I'll do it for half price. Whatever Collins asked for, I'll do it for half price. Wow. Collins came before Congress and said, well, last year I had $600,000. Next year I request $700,000. So what's Vanderbilt's offer going to be? I didn't ask how many are math majors. How many are math? We can do that. How much is it? Yeah, $350. That's exactly it. Vanderbilt said, bingo! Collins requested $700,000. I'll do the same service for $350,000. Whoa! Congress is now faced with a choice. You have a steamship service that Collins has been doing that he is requesting $700,000 in a subsidy next year to continue. And you have Vanderbilt saying, I'll do the same service for $350,000. Congress had a decision to make. And I have a question for you. How many of you think Congress accepted Vanderbilt's offer for the half price? Save some money. Boy, I saw someone do this and then looked around and then went like this real quickly. No, how many think Vanderbilt? There we go. One, two. Two people? Two people! Think we accepted the discount. How many think they gave Collins the $700,000? Look at that. You people ought to be ashamed of yourself. Why do you think they took Collins' offer when it's going to be twice as expensive? Yes. To save face? Yes. Familiarity? You know, this is good insight because I'll tell you, when I looked at the Congressional Record, back then it was called Congressional Globe, that is what I read a little bit into this. Now, it wasn't exactly those words. They didn't say, I think we need to save face. Right? But you can sort of see that is sort of what they're saying. They're saying, in fact, really, well, let me put it this way. Let me start the discussion this way. They had a debate. And when they had a vote, you know, an overwhelming majority of you thought that they gave him the subsidy. In this case, the majority is correct. They did. And a lot of this is, in fact, we had a senator get up and say, how do we know Vanderbilt can really do it? He says he can, but if he can't, we're back in England dominates everything. He comes in and says, I can do the job. We don't know if he can or not. We do know Collins can do it, right? And so Collins won the vote. Vanderbilt's half-price offer was rejected. Congress voted $700,000 to continue Collins running those steamships back and forth, his 4 steamships. What was interesting, Collins was delighted at the result. But when he came out shortly thereafter to New York City to go into the port to look at his ships, he saw something that was incredibly disturbing to him. There was his ship, no problem there. It was what was next to his ship was the problem. There was another ship there, and he didn't have to use much imagination to see what was happening, because the name of the ship was right on the side, and the name of the ship was the Vanderbilt. And Vanderbilt said, I'm going to go into the steamship business with no subsidy. And he was funny. He says, nobody tells me I can't do a steamship business. Those congressmen said they didn't think I could do it. Well, I'm going to do it, and I have no subsidy, and I'm going to do it. And what was even more demoralizing for Collins was that Vanderbilt said, I'm going to take off at the same time Collins does. And he just went zipping through the ocean, and in the distance you saw Vanderbilt way ahead of Collins. He said, I'm going to break records for time. And Vanderbilt broke the record for the fastest time over to England. It was 11 days and so many hours. And he did that, but one thing he found in doing that was that it used up coal and fuel very rapidly. To make a parallel to today, driving a ship through the ocean at top speed is like driving a car on the highway at top speed, say 90 miles an hour, 80 miles an hour. Are you more fuel efficient at 80 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour? Yeah. It's more fun at 80, isn't it? But at 50, it is more fuel efficient. And that's the same principle that's applied in shipping. And Vanderbilt's sitting there, whoa, I beat Collins, but look at all the fuel I used, and I don't have a subsidy to pay for it. So he started going slower than Collins back and forth to save on fuel. Vanderbilt had to figure out, how do I save on fuel? And one of the ways was he tended to be about 1 day per voyage slower than Collins. So if Collins would do it in 12 days, Vanderbilt typically would do about 13. And he said, that gives me time to do the refurbishing of the ship and get it ready to go on the next Monday. I still have enough time for the turnaround. So Vanderbilt was saving money there, and he found, you know, there are other ways he said I can save money. He cut prices for passengers from $120 to $150 a passenger to $30. And he called it was nicknamed the sardine class. We were packed more tightly than we are packed here. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be pleasant to live that way. You know, we're having a good time. But, you know, after 12 days, if you're like this, I know it's not going to be always wonderful. How many will admit that you snore? Yeah. I admit that Larry Reed snores back there. I do that because he admits I do. We've gone on conferences together and ended up keeping each other awake at night. Now, so, you know, I realize that it can be unpleasant to, you know, the crying baby is there and all of that. So I'm not saying that this is 12 or 13 days of luxury travel, but I am saying this. Think of it from an immigrant standpoint. For $30, if you can tough it out for 12, 13 days, you can get over here to the New World, whereas with Collins, it's $120. Granted, it's more of a luxury ship, but it is going to cost you a lot more. Vanderbilt also found he could make money selling food. He helped invent the potato chip. Then they were called Saratoga chips, but they were what we now call potato chips, and Vanderbilt helped invent them. So he was selling food to the people and making money on that. And then the other thing Vanderbilt did was he always had a full ship. See, Vanderbilt had the principle that economists call economies of scale worked out. His ships, because he had the low prices, always had about 600 passengers, which was the top of the line number you could get in there. Collins would typically have 200. Sometimes he'd have a little bit more, but maybe 100 to 200. But Vanderbilt's ships were always full. So Vanderbilt would sit there and say, 600 people at $30, plus the food and all of that. And if I'm going slower, you know, you can see where all this is cranking through Vanderbilt's mind. I can end up trying to save money. He saved money on insurance. For a while, he didn't have any insurance at all because he said, hey, if an insurance company can make money on insurance, so can I. So he was cutting costs. And here's what I'm here to tell you. At the end of a year of doing this, Vanderbilt turned a profit. Not a huge profit, but he actually made a profit at the end of his first year. And was that ever interesting coming into Congress? Vanderbilt, with zero subsidy, was making a profit. Collins came into Congress the next year, and the congressmen were looking at him, and he said, I request this year a subsidy of $858,000. And they said, why the big jump to $858,000? He said, because I'm losing business to Vanderbilt. I need a subsidy to compensate for the business that's been going to Vanderbilt. Congress now is faced with a vote. Do we give Collins $858,000 to continue his business? Or do we take it away? And I have a question for you. How many of you think Congress gave Collins the $858,000? Oh my gosh, a lot. How many think they did not give Collins $858,000? I'd say by about a 2-to-1 margin, you are voting that Congress gave Collins $800,000. You think Congress voted after all this, Collins $800,000? I see some people going, yeah, $858,000? In this case, the majority is right. And it was fascinating to read the congressional record. You had Senator William Seward of New York get up and say, I voted to give Collins his subsidy. There are some people who, in time of need, want to just throw out their friends. Just because someone can do something for 1 year only, a little bit cheaper, they're willing to throw out their friends. I'm not willing to throw my friends under the bus like that. He didn't say those words, but that was the exact words, but that was the thought he was conveying. I'm not going to desert my friends in time of need. Now, no one brought up that, hey, your friends are being supported by other people's money, tax dollars here. But nonetheless, that was a sentiment that helped drive the way to Congress voting to give Collins $858,000 to continue another year. Now, I'm happy to report, just as with you, in Congress, the vote was closer. And it made Collins nervous. And he thought, how can I advertise to promote my business? What can I do better than this other guy? What can I do better than Vanderbilt? What can he do better than Vanderbilt? Anybody think? he could build a bigger boat. I'm thinking, what already can he do that might be better than Vanderbilt? Can you think? He's faster. Yeah. He built an advertising campaign on that. Because he thought, I'm more expensive. And I've got a subsidy and all that. So he says, if your time is valuable, go on the Collins Mail Steamship Company. If your time is important, I am guaranteed the fastest ship overseas. If a day in your life is meaningless, and you are a meaningless person, just go ahead and go on Vanderbilt's ship. It'll just cruise through the ocean, go down, but I go with speed. So we had a huge advertising campaign that Collins undertook, and he discovered another thing that was very unpleasant, and that is that as his ship went on the next Monday over to England, Vanderbilt was there, and Vanderbilt just whoosh, was going at record speed all of a sudden. And you know what's going through Collins' mind, because he had instructions to his captain, make sure you beat any other boat that's going overseas, because we're advertising we're the fastest. And now here's Vanderbilt all of a sudden sacrificing the money, and Vanderbilt, in order to go faster, to beat me, and he was very upset with this, and it turns out, after a while, he overtook Vanderbilt's ship and beat it, but Vanderbilt had given instructions, compete for about 100 miles. You know, really go fast, and then let him pass you. Well, he'll never know how far behind you are, so he'll just keep chugging away, waste all that fuel, and then you just go ahead and go in there. So Vanderbilt had a certain sense of humor about this. Collins started really racing through there to always break records to have the fastest overseas steamship voyage. And he went very fast. He went too fast. How many have seen one of the versions of the movie The Titanic? Yeah, I have too. And as many of you know, the old ship hits the iceberg and sinks. The Titanic was not the first ship with a lot of people on board to hit an iceberg and sink. Collins may have that honor. At least he had a big one in 1854, whacks into an iceberg, sinks, killing over 400 Americans. There was another ship that was close enough that it got there and could see the driftwood, but the passengers were all dead. Then Collins had a ship. I mean, that was bad enough. He had a second ship that left Liverpool, England, shortly thereafter, in April 1855, and it hasn't arrived yet. It just sort of disappeared. Now, there may be a bureaucrat somewhere in the Secretary of Interior that's waiting for that ship, but at this point, it isn't going to do Collins any good. So you have one ship that we think probably also hit an iceberg and sunk, or something, and you have one that we know it sunk. And how much of Collins' fleet has now been lost? Half. Collins has an emergency request to Congress. I need a ship built to replace the one that was sunk. It's going to cost $1 million. I request a special $1 million emergency appropriation to build the ship to keep me in the game, to keep the competition going, to keep this steamship company alive. He did initially want two ships, but many congressmen said the other one that disappeared may appear, and so one, we know one was sunk, the other one may still yet appear. So we'll consider funding for one ship. And Congress is going to debate whether or not to give Collins $1 million to build another ship. And I have a question for you. How many of you think Congress voted Collins the $1 million to build another ship to stay into the competition? Well, quite a few. Quite a few. Let me look. How many think no? They voted no, no $1 million. This is so close, I want to see the hands again. How many think they did give him the $1 million? Did not give him the $1 million. A slight majority thinks they gave him the $1 million. A majority of you think they gave Collins $1 million to build another ship to stay in the competition. And in this case, the majority is right. Is right. They did it. They did it. Collins built the ship very quickly to get back in the race. He built it too quickly. Now, I know you're looking after those last ships. Oh my gosh. Let me use the naval term as we describe this ship as it went in the water from New York to Liverpool. I like to, in studying this, I studied naval records and all of this and used naval technology here to describe what happened with that other ship as it went into the water. The naval term is the ship took water. In other words, it was leaking. And it wasn't caulked very well because it was built so quickly so Collins could get in the race. And so the passengers in the ship, some of them became accustomed to this motion. Maybe that's our first government bailout. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But it was, I know some of you are thinking it sunk. It didn't. It didn't. When they arrived at Liverpool, the passengers got out, and I've read 2 accounts on this, and they weren't detailed, but they said the passengers got out and all of them were alive. I can imagine, they're getting out, and it's kind of this soggy pants and all of this, and they got out, and some of them it was cold on the ground. Woo! Kissing, they never thought they'd be on ground again, and they're all happy and everything. And Collins said everybody was alive. I got everybody over here alive. Collins was happy for the moment, but he was unhappy on the next Monday. The ship was ready, and most unpleasant to report, no passengers. No passengers for Collins' ship. And so Collins is in a quandary, and he's debating, I could repaint the ship and rename it, right? And then he thinks, well, they might know. And then he thinks, maybe I should just sell it at auction and then take the money and build another one because I'm going to have to do a whole lot of repair work to get this ready. Maybe that'd be the best thing to do. And that's what he does. He sends it at auction. Now, you understand, he paid $1 million for it. He's not going to be able to get $1 million back. But he'll get something, and then he can use that to build another ship. He's going to have to take a loss, and at auction, he did take a loss. The loss that he took on this ship when it sold was a loss of $990,000. It sold for $10,000. And I read one account, it said it was built for $1 million and it sold for $10,000. That's ridiculous. And then I read another account that said, would you have paid $10,000 for that ship? I thought that was an interesting question to ask. He says, that's about the market value of that ship, was $10,000. And so Collins has now $10,000, but he no longer has a ship. And he came to Congress, and he came in with a great deal of bluster. I need an appropriation for another ship, and here is $10,000 that I'm ready to contribute to its building. Last time I was here, less than a year ago, I requested $1 million. Am I requesting that this time? No, I'm not. I'm requesting 990,000. The 10 is right here, and I want to start off with that 10 and ask you for the next 990 to keep me in the competition to keep this steamship company alive. Whew. Congress listens to this request and has a debate. And I have a question for you. How many of you think that Congress voted 990,000 for Collins to build another ship to keep him in the race? Oh, some hands went way up immediately. Yeah, so I don't want to, but I am. So that's quite a few. How many think they did not give him the not million, but 990,000? This is a close. Let's have it again, another vote. How many think they did give him the million, or 990,000? Did not. A majority, slight majority, thinks they did not give him 990,000. When the votes were tabulated and the results were in, I can say definitively that in this case, with your vote, in this case, the majority here is right. Hey, that's kind of exciting. No, we're not giving you 990,000. You know, when I was writing this chapter, some people said I was cruel. I thought I'm not going to make a comment on this. I'm just going to let the senators themselves comment, right? So, I mean, I have a paragraph at the end of the chapter where just the senators themselves comment. And see if you can get at where these guys are at. Senator Judah Benjamin of Louisiana said, quote, "I believe the Collins line has been most miserably managed." Senator Robert Hunter of Virginia went further, quote, "The whole system was wrong. It ought to have been left like any other trade to competition." Senator John Thompson of Kentucky said this, quote, "Give neither this line nor any other line a subsidy. Let the Collins line die. I want a tabula rasa, the whole thing wiped out in a new beginning." Congress in 1858 voted a new beginning. They not only did not give Collins another ship, they didn't give him his annual subsidy either. Collins was no new ship, no annual subsidy. Within 6 months, he was bankrupt and went broke. Vanderbilt was competing very successfully here in the United States, going back and forth. There was plenty of competition because England had two companies, one of which still exists, the Cunard Steamship Company. Still exists. The Cunard Company was transporting passengers and goods and mail from Liverpool to the United States. They had another company called the Inman Steamship Company, also was in business in England, transporting passengers. And of course, we had Vanderbilt over here, who was also doing the same service. Plenty of competition. We spent $11 million on steamship subsidies. And our national debt in 1857 was $30 million. That is, the whole U.S. national debt is $30 million. And we spent $11 million on steamship subsidies. A third of the national debt on steamship subsidies. And all the time we had Vanderbilt, who was available as an entrepreneur to do it with no subsidy. Vanderbilt became the wealthiest person in U.S. history. He was the first American to be worth $100 million. He did it partly on steamships, but then he went into railroads after the Civil War. And his New York Central Railroad became a premier railroad in the country, cutting costs all over the country, going from New York to Chicago with great effectiveness. And so in steamships, by giving customers good products at low rates, Vanderbilt became the wealthiest American, #1. We didn't have a Forbes poll back then, but he was our wealthiest citizen, the first American to be worth $100 million. That is the story of the steamship industry and the rise of the United States through what we'd call market entrepreneurs, people relying on private enterprise and trying to produce a good product at a competitive price, versus the subsidized entrepreneurs. Now, I wish I could stand before you and say, we learned a lesson and we never forgot it, and boy, we didn't make that mistake again. Instead, I have to say we made that mistake again in about 2 years. We started, even during the Civil War in the 1860s, with subsidies for transcontinental railroads. The same principle as the steamships. The idea being that we need to connect the United States together, one end of the country to the other. And this is my favorite part of the talk because I get to draw the United States in its entirety. The Canadian border I gave you right there. Now, California, down here, over here. Oh, Texas, Florida, over. Woo! Ha ha ha! Thank you. Alaska is over here. Governor Palin is watching these subsidies. And we have railroads all over the eastern part of the United States. What we don't have is the western part. And the idea was, let's connect the United States with railroads. And let's hurry the process up by giving subsidies. Only we learned something from Vanderbilt and Collins. Here's what we've learned. We're not just going to give the Union Pacific subsidies to go across, right? We're going to subsidize 2 railroads with federal subsidies and let them compete. That's what we've learned. Competition is good, so we'll give 2 railroad subsidies. So we start with the Central Pacific in California. I'll put CP. Then we have UP, Union Pacific, starting in Omaha and moving westward. And the Central Pacific starting in California. And we're going to give them both subsidies. We're going to give them federal subsidies of $16,000 a mile, every mile that they build track. And you know, somebody pointed out to them, they thought, you know, they said, oh, well, that'll do it. And then somebody pointed out that there was something here that might cause a problem. What is that? The Rocky Mountains. And they, oh my gosh, yeah, and the politicians thought, what are we going to do about that? And then they thought, well, let's just give them more money. We'll give them $48,000 when they go over mountains per mile. See? So it's $16,000 on flat Nebraska. And then you get to hilly western Colorado, and then it's going to start being $48,000. That gives the incentives. And the same thing over here when they're doing mountain ranges over here, the Wasatch, you know, all those mountains. In fact, I think we have some people from the West Coast. Some from Washington, I think. Do we have some from Washington here? Yeah. Now, Washington isn't going to fit in right at the moment, but it will in a few minutes. Okay, so we're going to go across the country. Here we go. Well, what we found out, the first thing, I haven't quite drawn this right because it would look more like this if we would look at the railroad. Let me go back to my other map. The Union Pacific, when they realized they got $16,000 a mile, they thought, $16,000 a mile on this flat land of Nebraska? Well, the first thing they did was they built in the winter on the ice. Well, then they had to rebuild the whole thing, but they said, but we're getting subsidies all the time we build. Well, that was problem number one. Then they thought, my gosh, I hate running out of Nebraska. We're making so much money. So the railroad began to take on this. Look at all the mileage we're getting here. So the railroad began to do that. Then when they finally got west, they got to the Rocky Mountains out here, and they get there and they, whoa, the big things over here. Now, when you're building over mountains, if you have more than about a 6% grade, I mean, that's too much that you can travel over, is really high for a wheeled vehicle of any kind. Well, I mean, they thought, geez, what are we going to do? And so they just picked the lowest spot they could and kind of went over it. And I mean, it was more like a 12 to 15% grade. And they said, but that's okay because we're getting $48,000 a mile and there's no stipulation about trains being able to go over it or not. So we have a mountain that's unusable going over a railroad. And then once they got to the other side, they thought, woo, now we can get more mileage. And so they're going, and they're getting close to the Central Pacific. The two railroads are getting close. They're coming closer. They're getting close. And at this point, I have to say, we had the invention of dynamite, which was used for blowing up hills to make the grade flatter. The Union Pacific could have written a book called Dynamite, Its Uses and Abuses. It is, of course, used to flatten the terrain. One of the abuses we discovered was in the middle of the night sneaking over to the Central Pacific's line and blowing it up. And then in the morning saying, they don't get any money because they don't have track that they did that, so they don't get any money for building on it. Here is an interesting question I have for you. I wonder what the Central Pacific did in response to this. Because some of you missed some of my other questions, so I want to try another one. I'm going to give this one a multiple choice. The Central Pacific responded, A, they turned the other cheek. Because the Bible says there are times we've got to turn the other cheek. That's A. B, they thought, well, I guess we just ought to try rebuilding this and hope we can do it before the Union Pacific comes through here. That's B. And C, they, in the middle of the night, sneaked over to the Union Pacific line and started blowing it up. How many vote for A? B? Oh, we have a vote for B. C. In this case, the virtual unanimous vote is correct. Absolutely what happened. And Congress got involved because now nobody's building track. They're just blowing each other's track up. They're taking the subsidy money that they're getting from the government and using it for dynamite to blow the other guy's track up. And Congress says, we're upset and nobody's getting any more money to do this kind of thing. And if anybody blows up anybody's track anymore, we're not giving anybody any subsidy, and we mean it. And so the two railroads aren't going to blow each other up, and they move closer, and it looks like this. They refused to meet. They paralleled each other. They paralleled each other. And finally, Congress had to get involved again and say, you aren't going to each get subsidies for the mileage that you're going past the destination. Promontory Point is where you will meet. You will meet at Promontory Point. Nobody gets a nickel subsidy beyond that. So we have the meeting at Promontory Point, Utah, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. And they got together and they had a golden spike to put in to get the railroad. And they had Grenville Dodge of the Union Pacific take the jackhammer and swing to drive the nail in. And he missed. And Leland Stanford took a swing from the Central Pacific and missed. Finally, a foreman pounded in the golden spike. They had a massive celebration of drunkenness. Some of you may have seen the picture. It's in a lot of textbooks. And in the middle of the night, somebody stole the golden spike. And that's the story of our Transcontinental Railroad. We spent $60 million and gave away to those railroads $60 million of land for a railroad that we could not go from one end to the other. We had to use portage to get across the mountains. Now, some people said, yeah, but it was the only way to get across the country. One person who said, I am in the Vanderbilt spirit, his name was James J. Hill. That is where we burn our... Who's from Washington here? Are you from Seattle or that area, Everett or somewhere? Have you heard of James J. Hill? Oh, good. What did he do? But at least you've heard of him. That just makes me feel good. Who else has heard of James J. Hill? Oh, good. What did he do? Yes.
He's totally unsubsidized, and he's the only transcontinental railroad that actually made a profit and built on flat land. That makes sense.
Yeah, or was given it by the states. He either bought... Yeah, there was no incentive to do this stuff, was there? No, he did. And I like what you said. You said it so well. He did it with no subsidies. He started in Minneapolis, Minnesota, went all the way to Seattle with no federal subsidies. And when he got to the mountains, he said, I wonder how Lewis and Clark got across. He went back to the journals of Lewis and Clark, and they talked about the Marias Pass, which was a flat way in between. And he went back and found that and had a flat grade all the way. And when he was done with his unsubsidized railroad, it was the best built transcontinental and the only transcontinental that never went broke in the late 1800s. Every other one went broke. He did it with no federal subsidies. When this happened, congressmen said, the United States may beat Britain. It may not beat Britain, but we're not going to get hoodwinked again. We have lost with Collins. We lost with the Union Pacific and Central Pacific. We either, as a nation, the United States, we will prevail or we will not prevail, depending on our entrepreneurs. No more subsidies. Hill is chapter 2 of the book, Myth of the Robber Barons. What they said was, we'll either make it or we won't make it on the basis of entrepreneurs. We're going to have a period in the late 1800s in the United States that we virtually withdraw almost all subsidies. We have a few tariffs here and there, and that probably isn't so good. But we have the federal subsidy business dries up completely, and the United States is either going to surpass, we're going to move into world leadership on the basis of our entrepreneurs, privately financed, no more federal subsidies. And what we're going to find, the United States, after the Civil War, in that 50-year period, after the Vanderbilt disaster and after the Transcontinental disaster, moves into world leadership as entrepreneurs emerge to start the oil industry. John D. Rockefeller. What was the name of his company? Standard Oil. It has, now listen to this. It was so successful, no federal subsidy. It was so successful, he was selling oil at 8 cents a gallon. Now, even by today's standards, that would be more, but it would still be less than $1 a gallon. Now, his oil that he was selling was the cheapest in the world, and he had, one American company had a world market share. I'm talking about Rockefeller. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company in 1900 had a world market share, world, of 65%. That sounds so good, I want to say it again. Not everything I've said this hour I want to say again, but that I do. John D. Rockefeller was such a great oil entrepreneur. I have a chapter on him about how he had economies in refining oil. He figured out ways to cut costs. Nobody in the world could produce oil cheaper than Rockefeller. And at the end of the 1800s, he had one company sold 65% of all the oil in the world. One American company has a 65% market share. That is where you move into great economic growth. We had Andrew Carnegie. What's his industry? Steel from Pittsburgh. Carnegie comes in and produces the absolute most fantastic and cheapest and strongest steel rails. Charles Schwab innovates in structural steel, building the Empire State Building and other buildings in the early 1900s. The end result is the United States moves into steel leadership of the world. oil leadership of the world. I'd say that Henry Ford was given a nice advantage in the early 1900s. The 1900s become the American century. In part, the auto industry becomes the major world industry in the first half of the 1900s. And Henry Ford is given the best gasoline and oil prices and the best steel prices. The Americans now have one advantage, and we transfer that into the 20th century and give Ford an advantage. The United States is moving rapidly with free markets into world leadership. The late 1800s, the early 1900s, a marvelous period of American history. Relative freedom, move away from the subsidies, the rise of the United States in an atmosphere of freedom, individual liberty, and some of the most fantastic entrepreneurs that we have ever had in American history. Let's have some questions. Thank you.